Okay, so we just had a little technical difficulty. Let's call it a glitch. And then in the interim, I just had this sort of realization of like the way that we're doing this, like historicizing. It's almost like we're justifying the existence of
Yeah.
stereotypes, or trying to. It's a common trap that media historians fall into all the time, which you just end up reifying like that blondes and brunettes have this natural dynamic that would inevitably make its way into media because of our need for visual difference or something. And it's like striking me that the reason that I couldn't find any literature doing what I'm doing now is because no one believes that that's where blondes and brunettes come from. It's just like any stereotype, it's like, to use myself as an example, like Jews being greedy or whatever. It comes from a long history that isn't based on a real thing that happened, and trying to historicize it by saying, well, Jews were moneylenders is not, it doesn't justify the stereotype. The stereotype
Right.
exists outside of that. And then with blondes and brunettes, those stereotypes, they work their way into our media and then become a part of people's sexual desires, and then they stick. And there's no real point in over historicizing. I think, I'm not saying everything we said was invalid, but I don't know. I'm just, be wary of people like us who think that we can tell you exactly where a trope comes from, when it's just sometimes people's biases and the biases of the people who write the media that creates our society.
Right. And, like we were going to talk about redheads, but, as you were saying, and during our quick discussion, what are we going to say? They're fiery or unloved, and that's about it. Like,
right. It's, I'm sure that you guys who have been listening this far have been interested in us looking at the specific examples and how they might play out differently or similarly to, to others. But ultimately, you guys all know what the stereotypes of these different hairstyles are. You don't need us to point out examples of them. You just intuitively know that, blondes are innocent, brunettes are not, redheads are fiery, and that it only holds up for Caucasian women, and only in certain film contexts like 1950s America, and that it doesn't hold up anywhere outside of that, because it's not a human essential trait that blondes are a certain way and brunettes are not. It just doesn't work that way. So we were going to shift into, maybe the more problematic aspects of how one man's obsession with a particular hair color can create an incredibly abusive environment, and then create an abusive critical environment following it, where if that person is heralded as a genius filmmaker, unparalleled in his time, they might overlook the damage that he does. So trigger warning for sexual abuse and for rape, but we're going to go into the Hitchcock Blonde briefly. So for those of you who don't know, Hannah, can you explain what is meant by the term Hitchcock Blonde?
So Alfred Hitchcock preferred to cast blondes and blonde women, but they were also, often the ones to get murdered.
Right. Well, they were, there's a complex sort of thing with that, but he mostly cast them like after the 1950s hit. So some people will claim, oh, he was just sort of catering to general Hollywood tastes, but in reality, it's more like he was catering to his own very specific fetishy tastes. And he also saw blonde women as innocent, or as seeming innocent. And what he liked to do was portray them as these femme fatale characters who would go out and commit crimes or seduce men, and you wouldn't expect it because you wouldn't expect a blonde girl to do something bad. And
right.
he said that, but that's just him saying that. And in reality, he was, sexually interested in all these women that he cast in these roles. And, he would emotionally abuse them, sometimes out of his own obsession with them. So, I mean, the main example that people use, because she was one of the first to come forward, was Tippi Hedren, who he cast in, multiple films. I first saw her in Marnie, which is a story about rape and sexual coercion. In that story, Marnie compulsively steals money and has a repressed trauma from her mother being a prostitute that means that she can never be with men. And so Sean Connery seduces her and then blackmails her into marrying her, and then on their honeymoon cruise rapes her, and ultimately sort of like does the whole like shake her until she stops being crazy thing, and goes through this mystery to find out where her trauma with men came from and why she can never truly be with a man. But ultimately it's almost portrayed as like a service that he does for her, even though after he rapes her, Hitchcock does portray her attempting suicide in the next scene. So it's, Marnie is in some ways a typical Hitchcock blonde, because she's, empowered in her taking control over her own life, stealing money, seducing men, whatever, and visually empowered through this metaphor of her riding this horse, which is the one thing that she ever loved, which connotes almost like a queer anti-men, hate, like that her hatred of men is almost like lesbian or queer, in that she loves riding horses. Horses are also this like signifier of masculinity, so it's like a complicated thing. But basically, the story of Marnie is the story of Alfred Hitchcock abusing Tippi Hedren emotionally in like every scene, and also offset, and like mailing her daughter a doll of her in a coffin, just weird shit like that. And that gets baked into the critical consensus around Alfred Hitchcock about whether he is, brilliantly portraying the psychosexual feelings of his audience, or whether he's just indulgently showing his own fetishes on screen.
Yeah, which is often the case for another show called Totally Spies.
Tell me about Totally Spies, Hannah.
Basically every episode is just a different writer's fetish. Like it's the classic thing. You have every flavor of white or not black girl. You got a blonde, a brunette, and a redhead. This one sort of plays with the tropes a little. The redhead is like the smart leader, though you kind of get that with the Powerpuff Girls too.
That's true.
Like there's very much the Powerpuff Girls kind of vibe to the Totally Spies girls.
In this, I think Alex is she's the sporty one, but she's also kind of dumb as well, or innocent.
Yeah, I mean, she's just not as smart as Sam. Is Sam? Yeah, Sam's the redhead. But then we get dumb blonde Clover, which matches up with
she's fashion
Ditzy
obsessed.
Bubbles.
She's a Beverly Hills. She's a Valley girl.
Yeah.
The Valley Girl stereotype being associated with blondness or bleach blondness is, that also has its long roots. I mean, we can see that in Legally Blonde as well, which I think was the most recent attempt to kind of subvert the trope by buying into it 100%, in the way that a lot of people did this with a lot of things in the early 2000s, where it was, you embrace the stereotype in order to critique it.
Right.
And so it's like, even if you were to see the most Valley Girl, LA stuck up, rich, privileged, nouveau riche, dumb
Right.
blonde character, she could still be a great lawyer and graduate from Harvard first in her class and
Right.
be brilliant. And I think that's why a lot of people, still today see Elle Woods as like the feminist icon, because she embraces like a form of femininity that is so easy to look down on.
There's a great video about Legally Blonde in that talks about how we end up rooting for Elle because it's like a weird class issue, and her blondness ends up being part of that, the way we perceive Elle's class.
Right. It's class outside of just how much money she has, because she's rich.
Right.
She's richer than most of her classmates, but she's not old money, and so she's not seen as class E.
Right. Exactly.
Her outfits are garish on the East Coast. And I mean, I don't know anything about like if that still exists as a perception, the East Coast versus West Coast thing.
I think it is. I think it totally does.
I mean, I lived in LA for a little bit and I didn't notice a particular difference in people's dress, but besides it being warmer physically there than on the East Coast. But I didn't notice like a superficiality to, that doesn't exist in Brooklyn, for example.
Right. Exactly.
So I don't know. It's interesting that they're like relying on those stereotypes to build the story around, that they're subverting it in that instead of a sort of mousy brown-haired girl being overlooked for a party girl who doesn't really love the guy, it's instead sort of the other way around, where the blonde sorority girl is being overlooked for someone considered more serious. And that's how it starts, is that she's looking for marriage, but she's seen as not serious enough, and that she sees the only way to become serious is to become a Harvard lawyer.
Right. But and part of it is that she learns that she can become a Harvard lawyer while also wearing pink, man.
Right. And like the way that she breaks stereotype is that she is good on paper. She can ace tests. She can memorize facts and laws and things like that some of her classmates can't even do.
Right.
But she adheres to stereotype in that she, has like sorority things just keep coming up about her being a sorority girl,
right?
Where, sorority girls keep secrets for one another, and sorority girls, don't snitch, I guess. It's just sort of a means of keeping her on the outside of this law clique that has been asked by Victor Garber to help adjudicate a case.
Right.
Yeah, but in the end, she ends up doing the case on her own with a little help from them, kicking Victor Garber off the case for sexually harassing her. So, I guess it all works out. But in the end, like, aren't we still just reinforcing like an extremely stereotypical view of blondness in order to subvert the idea that blondes are dumb? I mean, like, we all know that blondes aren't really dumb in real life, and there are plenty of blonde characters who aren't dumb and who aren't stereotypical. So why do we need a stereotypically blonde character to then surprise us by being good at, law?
I mean, it's the same trap that we were falling into with this very episode, where it seems it's so in the cultural milieu that sometimes we feel like we need to address it, and I think
are we not addressing blonde bias? I mean, this is another thing, right? Like,
yeah,
white women have certain kinds of privileges. Would you not agree with that?
Absolutely, we do.
At least 100%. They're not available to, women of color. and that we associate blonde girls with pretty girls. That's another level of privilege as well. And then it seems like when we talk about blonde bias, we rarely address the actual sexism that is universal,
right?
Which I think is the only thing of blonde bias that is consistent, because obviously the point in Legally Blonde is that, yeah, she's not being biased against for being stupid. She's being biased against for being a woman.
Right.
That's what's really happening here. And that's what we realize by the end. But like, I think it's like a common claim of blonde women, like, so they'll say like blonde women are the only people who it's acceptable to, be stereotypical, to be prejudiced against.
Right.
Which is obviously not the case. Like in our society, it's surprisingly acceptable to be a bigot. You can achieve a lot of power while still being a bigot. So I don't know.
Yeah, I think it feels stupid to maybe use the word intersectional when it comes to like hair color, right. Especially when we're talking about like the treatment of white women. Exactly. But I just don't see a body of
literature about it at all. Like I don't see when people talk about intersectionality talking about blonde privilege or brunette privilege.
So I mean, in doing a little bit of research, it didn't relate specifically to media, so I didn't necessarily bring it to you. But there's a lot of studies about hair color privileges when promoting CEOs. And that for men, they tend to prefer brunettes, and for women, they tend to prefer blondes. And that is the way when, in corporate settings, when you're looking at specifically the CEO level. But I think the authors suggest that it's possible at all levels of hiring and promotion as well, that, we have these biases towards brunette men and blonde women and white people in general.
And I think that's definitely something that it's important for anyone in a position of power to be cognizant of, to be aware, and to fight it when it's possible. But mostly from other women who, in terms of solidarity, because if a man is just saying, well, I can't be biased in favor of blondes, then I'll just pick a brunette, like that doesn't really solve the issue. The point is the man shouldn't be in charge of deciding that in the first place, whether a blonde or a brunette should be in power based on their visual attraction.
Right. And I think it goes also to internalized misogyny. When you see a lot of those, trad wife stuff, she's usually blonde. When you see stuff where I'm not like other girls, and like the sexist side of that, because, I won't get into that.
It's an important point. I'm glad that you bring it up.
Because, not like other girls
it
thing
all becomes internalized as well.
Yes.
It's not just male gaziness one directionally. It's internalized and
enforced between women.
Blonde is a trope in media that then becomes part of these memes that get posted on Facebook as part of real girls' real identities, that they're not
right
girls because other girls are blonde is essentially the implication.
Right. Or, blondes like these things, and these are who the hot, pretty, popular, desirable girls are, and it's represented by blondness.
Because in media they are. In media they are displayed as more desirable in a lot of cases.
Yes.
Unless you're doing the subversion where it's the hometown girl next door blonde being overlooked for the rich, snobby,
sexy
brunette. Yeah.
Worldly.
Right. The evil brunette. So I think there are real consequences to these things. It's just not the same as racism or sexism,
No. And I mean, it does intersect in the fact that most blonde people are Caucasian, they're white, and most not blonde people
against women.
Right. But then also like there's if we're talking about attractiveness bias, which is also a thing in general, sometimes that bias is towards blonde women in certain situations, as we saw with the study about the CEO promotions,
right.
And
but I guess the question with that is, does media have any power whatsoever to affect those kinds of things? I mean, obviously we know representation matters when it comes to, depicting people of a particular race in non-stereotypical ways, allowing people to portray themselves. But like you said, when it comes to blondes and brunettes, this stuff is highly internalized. And because it's wholly centered on white women, one of the most commonly portrayed groups of people in any medium, women
besides white men.
But that's what I'm saying. It's like,
right.
You can't fix it by just having more white women.
Right.
It doesn't solve the problem. If anything, it exacerbates it. So I guess I'm struggling here to find like a silver lining in how do you use media to combat this? And I think it's like you just have
David, I think anime has the answer, and that everyone should have purple hair.
Blondness just means you're a gaijin, and any other hair color just means you're Japanese, including the many colors of the rainbow.
I mean, I do want to just very briefly touch on the very fun Japanese trope with hair colors, where blue usually means you're kind of like the demure shy girl.
Yeah.
I don't know why that's a thing, but it is.
A German tsundere. We're just talking about Evangelion, right?
I mean, Evangelion, but it's in tons of modern anime. It's in Sailor Moon, like it's
hair in Sailor Moon.
Mercury.
Oh, well, she's blue themed, but it's more like dark.
But it's blue. It's blue.
You're right.
It's blue. And like there's a lot of in general, it's a trope, is the demure blue-haired anime girl.
Yeah, it's just going off of the general, and like this is where you can almost say, because it's so primary color driven and it's so cartoony, you can almost do the simplistic route we were doing earlier and say, yeah, red means hot, blue means cool. That's a socially constructed thing, but it is pretty universal to humans.
Right. It has no basis in reality. But it's the red oni, blue oni thing of Japanese media, like as two strong contrasting colors that, dynamic contrast, blah, blah, blah. So I think we should just dye everyone's hair like an absurd shade of red and blue and purple and green. And then this problem goes away.
Yeah.
That's my solution.
Have a different take, or you think our, radical departure halfway through an episode was interesting, tweet at us and let us know your thoughts on what these stereotypes do, what your personal relationship is to them, and again, who is best girl, Betty or Veronica?
Yeah.
So let us know at Talking Tropes. You can check out our video podcasts on YouTube or listen to this podcast wherever you're currently listening to it. I'm going to cut that because it's totally pointless. I don't know why I said it. What do we normally say?
We say tweet at us at Talking Tropes. Next week, we're going to talk about...
Oh, okay. So we'll just say, all right, well, it's great to be back. And we'll see you guys next week with another Standing Stanley Tucci.
Bye-bye.
Bye.